In a divided world, how do you get 195 countries all on the same page? From Sao Paulo to Seoul, the Financial Times is the common thread connecting bright minds. It's read in every country recognised by the United Nations, by people who need trusted insight to make confident decisions. And with reporters in over 40 international bureaux, you can trust the FT to tell the global stories that matter, clearly and without compromise. Read more and subscribe at ft.com.
US President Donald Trump has sought to brand it the 12-Day War. The conflict, which began with Israeli airstrikes against Iranian nuclear and Iranian military sites and individual Iranian military officers, escalated into exchanges of missiles and drones between Israel and Iran, then ended, so Trump hopes, with American airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities at Isfahan, Natanz and Fordow, followed by a somewhat theatrical and altogether ineffectual Iranian swipe at an American airbase in Qatar. If Iran hoped this last gesture would be seen as a demonstration of defiant strength, the ambition was somewhat undermined by Trump publicly thanking Tehran for communicating the timing in advance. The 12-Day War label is an unsubtle attempt to equate the conflict with the Six-Day War of 1967, a previous preemptive offensive in which Israel humiliated enemies threatening it with destruction, in that instance Egypt, Syria, Jordan and Iraq. But the 12-Day War label also pretty clearly seeks to suggest that the matter is now concluded. It is unlikely that either Israel or Iran believes this to be the case. Israel clearly thinks that it has Iran on the run. Israel's response to the Hamas attack of October 7, 2023, has substantially dismantled the apparatus of baneful regional influence that Tehran had spent decades assembling. Iran's proxies Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen are much diminished. The militias Iran sponsors in Iraq have gone prudently quiet. Iran's puppet Bashar al-Assad in Syria is in exile in Russia. And Iran remains officially committed to the obliteration of Israel. Amid the recent mayhem, Israel claimed to have destroyed the digital clock in Palestine Square in Tehran, counting down to Israel's doom, predicted by Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei for 2040, a date at which the currently 86-year-old Ayatollah will likely not be available to field impatient questions about why this has not occurred. Subsequent reports suggest the clock is still ticking. Has the 12-Day War really settled anything? What options does the Iranian regime have left? And what if it has merely postponed rather than prevented a nuclear-armed Iran? This is the Foreign Desk.
Khamenei's ideology that wanted to make Iran an Islamist society domestically and some sort of anti-Israel belligerent power regionally and internationally, that is dead.
Netanyahu's calculations are heavily influenced by Netanyahu, but the Trump administration just doesn't think this through. They really believe that every act in foreign policy is a half-hour episode of a reality show, and then they move on to the next thing.
The regime is a humiliated lunatic, and there's nothing more dangerous than an angry, humiliated lunatic.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. My first guest is Arash Azizi, contributing writer at The Atlantic and the author of What Iranians Want. Arash, first of all, is it possible to discern what the first understanding Iranians may have had was that the United States had joined the attack?
The attack by the United States was in a way unexpected, especially because Donald Trump seemed to not be going there in the couple of days before the attack. So it was a bit of a surprise, but it's not a surprise in the broader terms. It was always clear that an attack by Trump was a very real possibility. And that's why Iran had joined the negotiations. It knew that the alternative is an attack. So it wasn't entirely a surprise act, even though, you could say it was 40 years in coming in some ways. And at the end of the day, it was an attack, not one that caused civilian casualties, unlike the Israeli attacks. And it was targeted, on exactly where they knew it was going to be an attack. So in a way, it was a very choreographed attack, even though it was on sites that are obviously of immense importance.
Iranian authorities are reporting some civilian casualties, about 600 Iranian dead in total, which obviously will not have endeared Iranian people to the United States and Israel any further. But what has been reported by Iranian media about the extent of damage done by the Israeli and US strikes? I mean, how free to report on any of that are Iranian news agencies?
Well, there is no freedom of press in Iran. There even some people who are trying to report on the damages caused were arrested, actually. But the fact of the matter is the damage is real. Hundreds of civilians, as you mentioned, 600. I think the actual number is probably higher. I was just referring to the American strikes on Fordo, but during the Israeli strikes, of course, hundreds of civilians, including children, men and women, have died. Just one very heart-wrenching case that I know in Astana Ashrafieh, is a little town in north of Iran. Israelis were trying to kill a nuclear scientist. They killed 16 members of his family with him, including young children, on their unbelievable attack on Evin prison, which is really a shameful attack. They apparently called it a symbolic attack. They killed political prisoners, the very people they claim to defend, as well as a lot of other random people. Someone who was there to bail out his friends. So there are tons of people dead in these attacks. And yes, there are restrictions on how to report it. Let me just say this. There was all these debates in Iran whether the attacks will have a rally around the regime, rally around the flag effect. I think we have not had a rally around the flag effect, if by this we mean support for the regime. What we absolutely have had is people gathering with each other. People have rallied around each other. And I saw some people from Iran, some well-known activists, Mr. Yazdi, who is a social democratic activist in Iran, saying this. Mr. Debashi, who's, these are people who are very critical of the Israeli attacks. They really, support their nation. They use very aggressive language, you can say, in defense of Iran, but they're very clear. This is not people coming to support the regime. It's the people, Iranian people, coming to support each other, stand for each other at this tough moment in time.
I mean, when you talk about the Iranian people supporting each other, do you detect a similar mood to what we saw 3 years ago, those protests after the death of Mahsa Amini in the custody of the so-called morality police? These became known as the Woman Life Freedom protests.
No, this is a very different situation. In those protests, people came together against the regime, and they took this action against the regime. In this case, it's not for the regime, but it's not against the regime either. It's people literally trying to stay alive. Landlords saying, it's okay, you don't need to pay rent this month because I know it's a war and stuff. People fled Tehran, right? Thousands of people fled Tehran, and including, my own grandmother. A lot of my family members left Tehran for a few days. They would go to a random city in the north of Iran or south of Iran, and there were people on the street with signs saying, you can come and stay with us for free because we are a nation trying to help each other. Look, there was no serious food shortage. There was no serious crisis. Why do you think there was no food shortage? Because people were considerate. They understood that they only have each other. Iranians have felt pretty helpless in the last 2 weeks because of the decisions in Tel Aviv and Washington and wherever Ayatollah Khamenei's bunker is that determines their life. But I think they've understood that they do have each other. They will stand for each other for the basic sort of means of security and mutual aid, effectively. So I think that's what we've seen. We've seen a spirit of solidarity that is frankly heartwarming. But it's not so much about politics. I think the political future is very uncertain and people trying to work through that. I think they're very angry at the regime for bringing them to this point. They're angry at Netanyahu for killing them. They're angry at Trump for being so cavalier about their lives. They're angry at the world. But they do have each other.
I mean, is it going to be possible, though, for the regime to completely suppress that anger? I'm just wondering whether this is potentially a dangerous moment for the regime.
It's a complicated situation because there is no prospect of an immediate social uprising to bring down the Islamic Republic because there is no opposition leadership. There is no clear political alternative to the regime. That could be built yet, but Iran does not have a serious opposition. The regime has been able to suppress the opposition inside Iran and outside the country. So that's not really sort of a immediate prospect. I think the changes are going to come likely from within the regime. The composition, the policies, and the orientation of the regime is likely to go through important changes. In many ways, we've already entered the post-Khamenei Iran. Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, at 86 years old, he always promised death to America and death to Israel. At the moment of truth, when Iran was fighting America and was fighting Israel, he hid like a little mouse in his bunker. And in his last message, he is a shadow of his former self, you can see. He's frail, he can't finish a sentence, he's not taking responsibility. Unlike what people say, he doesn't quite sound defiant either. Yeah, he says like we won't surrender, but he's not really taking the fight back to Americans like he would claim. So he's very much a frail figure, and already different military, political, and financial factions in Iran are vying, sort of duking it out for the control of the country in the future. Change is more likely to come from there.
Well, you wrote in The Atlantic this week of assorted insider plots, and I do recommend that article to our listeners because it is very interesting. But how much likelihood is there that if anything did replace Khamenei, or if the regime was changed, altered in some respect, that it wouldn't actually be worse? Like, for example, could there be a full-scale takeover by the IRGC?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure if a full takeover by the IRGC would actually be worse. And I don't think that's a very likely outcome. But look, no, I mean, it could be worse. It could be better in some ways, worse in other ways. Unfortunately, what it means is that none of these factions are going to really offer democracy. Some of them might offer a little more democracy. But I will tell you this, it's hard to predict Iran, but I would say this: Khamenei's ideology, his doctrinaire Islamist ideology that wanted to make Iran an Islamist society domestically and some sort of anti-Israel belligerent power regionally and internationally, that is dead. That is very much on its deathbed. The new Iran is likely to be more pragmatic, interested in economic development, hopefully moving away from death to America to long live Iran. Then would be very much in the regional mood, like Saudi Arabia, like Syria, like other countries that have, if you've noticed in the past, little while, many countries in the Middle East have put in their disputes aside, and instead they are focused on their own economic development, and they have relationship, sort of businessman-like, a state-to-state relationship with each other. This also explains the, reformation of ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia, who now have full diplomatic relations. Iran now has relations with Egypt. So I think it's quite likely that we'll go there.
Just finally then, I mean, everything you're describing, this idea of a more pragmatic, reasonable, open Iran is something that would be, well, a fantastic thing for the people of Iran and would be much welcomed, as you suggest, by not just the region, but pretty much the entire world. That being the case, is there anything that any outside players could do to accelerate that outcome that wouldn't make things worse? Or is this something everybody should just leave the Iranian people to figure out for themselves?
Well, I think if outside figures can link up to those sections in Iran who want to move toward that direction, it would be better. I think Saudis have done that to a deal. I think United States should try to offer a good diplomatic path to Iran. That way, it would strengthen those in Iran who are, diplomatically inclined. I do want to say that I don't want to give a rosy picture, though, because this transition can be a rocky road. It's also possible that the post-Khamenei Iran will be more military, sort of muscular at first. But I think ultimately, because it would be not about Islamist ideology, but Iranian national interest, I think ultimately it would be better for Iran and the region. But it is surely, this being the Middle East, we have a rocky road to get there.
Arash Azizi at The Atlantic, thanks for joining us. Arash's book, What Iranians Want, is out now. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller, and joining me now is Tara Kangarlou, Global Affairs Journalist, Adjunct Professor at Georgetown University and the author of The Heartbeat of Iran, and Tom Nichols, Staff Writer at The Atlantic and author most recently of Our Own Worst Enemy. Tom, to you first, do we yet know for sure what kind of a success the US raid and the preceding Israeli campaign were?
We don't. We can guess. We have some preliminary indications, but battle damage assessment takes a while, as General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, keeps trying to tell people, but the administration doesn't want to hear that. They want to declare victory and move on. But how much was destroyed, how permanent the damage is, it's clear there was damage. It's clear that this program has been set back, but by how much and in what ways, we just don't know yet.
Tara, what then do we infer from Iran's apparent willingness, for the moment at least, to call it a draw? We saw them release that somewhat theatrical volley of missiles at Qatar, which was clearly telegraphed, planned, confirmed in advance, all of which was shot down anyway. And then the ceasefire, at the risk of tempting fate, appears to have held since then. Was that Iran saying, that's enough, we don't want to do this anymore, or are they storing something up?
I think the Iranian regime has been shooting themselves in the leg for many years. This is not the first time we're seeing such quote unquote coordinated attacks. We saw this last year in response to the Israeli killing of Ismail Haniyeh. And also, if you recall, back in 2020, in retaliation to Qasem Soleimani's assassination by then President Trump. And so the Iranian regime is very well aware that they are not capable of fighting with the world's greatest military might, and that being Israel and the United States combined. So they're very well aware of that. And on top of that, we need to understand that the Islamic regime is categorically resented by the Iranian public. We're talking 90 million people, of whom the majority want this regime gone. So they are very well aware that for their own existence and survival, they need to come to the negotiating table and work with the United States. And that's quite frankly what the sentiment among the civil society in Iran is that, you know what, they spend over 3 decades building this nuclear program, spending trillions of dollars of our money, of people's money, and now it's poof gone. To what end? To really our detriment. So I think the regime is caught in their hubris and arrogance. At the same time, they want to negotiate because otherwise they can't survive.
Tom, there did seem to be something of an opportunist aspect to Israel deciding to strike Iran now. Israel has been complaining for years that Iran's nuclear ambitions constitute an existential threat to their state. But obviously, since October 7th, 2023, we have seen Iran's reach across the Middle East substantially reduced. Do you get the sense that President Trump made a similar calculation that this has to be done at some point, or this is probably inevitable, we might as well do it now while they're weak?
The Israelis, you can't disentangle domestic issues here. I mean, Netanyahu chose a moment of political danger for him, political weakness for him, and he launched a preventive war to take out this capability. Whether he had to do it right now, I mean, I don't think the arguments that this was a case for preemption, where there was some sort of imminent attack looming, I don't think those hold up very well. And I think Trump doesn't really make calculations. Trump thinks transactionally that, that Netanyahu convinced him this was a good opportunity for Trump to look strong, to order U.S. military forces into action and get a quick win. And I think that's partly why you're seeing the administration demanding and insisting that they got a quick win, because I think that was the going in position. And now, of course, the real world being a lot more complicated and nuanced, they don't want to hear about how long it's going to take to figure this out. So, I think there was opportunism all around. And I think in typical Trump fashion, this probably wasn't a particularly well thought out operation. It was well executed, but from a strategic level, I think he was thinking more in terms of his political fortunes than in terms of the circumstances right now for doing this.
To that end, I think so many in Iran are looking at this as a potential opportunity. I mean, as grim as the situation for the ordinary civil society looks like, they're saying that, listen, they didn't get rid of this regime, something that Israel was up until just a few days ago very adamant toward. But the only way that this can be a win-win for both the Iranian civil society and perhaps President Donald Trump would be if he bets on Iran's most valuable asset, and that is the people of Iran. You're looking at an extremely sophisticated and educated civil society. Nearly 70% of college graduates are women. You have some of the most vibrant when it comes to technology, engineering, mathematics, and science in that entire region. And the argument that I'm hearing from Iranian people inside Iran is, listen, the US and Israel don't care about us. We are now left once again with the regime and these two powers to be. But if the president of the United States wants to actually engage with Iran, it will be beneficial to engage commercially and economically, because that would result in billions of dollars of financial engagement between, both the Americans and the Iranians. And I think this is a nuanced point to think about, right? If they are going to keep the regime of Iran intact, then how can they engage with that country so vibrant to actually benefit the people as well?
Tom, everything Tara says there is absolutely correct. Iran is a monstrously untapped resource in all sorts of respects. There is nothing but its own government preventing it from being a great and constructive nation. Do you get the sense, though, that President Trump has the patience to engage with it to the degree that would be necessary to bring that about?
Well, as Tara was speaking, I thought, well, that's all a great. I mean, I wish you were advising Trump, but that's not the way Donald Trump thinks. I mean, he's already said, yeah, we want to have negotiations and we want to open things up, and that's pretty hard to do, particularly for any American administration, and it would require a lot of adept diplomacy and patience and thoughtfulness, and that's just not what this administration's about. I mean, Trump's already making it clear that he thought this was a one and done, and he wants to move on. And the Israelis began this talking about stopping nuclear proliferation, but really they were trying to kind of light the spark of regime change. And now Trump is already backpedaling, saying he's not interested in regime change. Didn't really care about that. It was about, again, it was a big made-for-television production with the B-2s, and the dramatic footage from Whiteman Air Force Base and all that stuff. Like many authoritarian regimes, there is a great nation waiting to emerge from under a bad government. I think that's true in a lot of places, in Korea and Russia and Iran and many places. But Donald Trump just doesn't have the attention span or the interest or the ability to think in those terms. And I'm sorry to say, I don't think that's going to happen under this administration.
I mean, Tara, if we look at the current situation from the Iranian regime's point of view, they are, of course, like all regimes, interested in their own survival. Do they have any good options at the moment as they further that interest? Can they, for example, even begin to think about rebuilding that network across the Middle East, which has been substantially dismantled over the last 18 months or so?
That's a great question. So I think for their own longevity, sure, they might do that and engage in that. However, they have seen that proxy apparatus can very easily be destroyed, as we saw in the last 12 months, right? And I don't say this to sound idealistic, but I truly believe this because I know the Iranian society very well. And that is, if the Iranian regime is, again, interested in building strength and might, they too should bet on their own people. Okay. Number one, the talks that we're hearing right now in the last 48 hours about Iran's nuclear capability being destroyed, how much of it is destroyed, where are the uraniums, and so on and so forth. We all know very well that bombs and missiles and strikes cannot destroy scientific advancement. The brains are there. So if the Iranian regime wants to rebuild its nuclear program, they very well can, because the technology and the brain power is there. But if the Iranian regime is interested in its survival, aside from whatever back channel dealings that they're having, with US, Israel, if they're going to come to the negotiating table, if the US, Israel are going to keep the status quo, they need to listen to their own people. And this is something that I've been extremely worried about, that the day after the war ends, which is now, the Iranian regime has shown intense crackdown against people. And that's what has been worrying ordinary Iranians. They were worried that once the dust settles, they're going to come after us, because the Iranian regime has realized the severe infiltration and penetration of the Israeli intelligence within, their military and intelligence. And so now, as this woman in Iran that I was speaking with said, the regime is a humiliated lunatic, and there's nothing more dangerous than an angry, humiliated lunatic. So just just today, we've been seeing restaurants being shut down, people arrested. This fashion designer was just arrested today in Tehran. So the regime is cracking down on its own people, more fearful than ever before. So Andrew, coming back to your question, sure, they can build their proxies and that too can be destroyed. But you know what? If they want to stand in power, I think they should listen to their own people, listen to what they want, and give them the power, because that's the only way that you are going to have a strong Iran at a time that, again, 90 million people feel suffocated and don't want this regime.
But if they were that kind of regime in the first place, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah, no, I agree with you.
That's the problem. And the alternative that they have available to them is the Putin's Russia or North Korea alternative. And one of the concerns about this strike is, does it push them more toward, if not regime change, towards some kind of opening or liberalization, or does it push them in the North Korea direction, which says that the real way that the regime survives is to crack down and build a nuclear device as quickly as possible as an insurance policy? And this is where I come back to saying, I don't think the Israelis, Netanyahu's calculations are, in my view, heavily influenced by Netanyahu, but the Trump administration just doesn't. They're not the kind of people to think this through. They really believe that, every act in foreign policy is a half-hour episode of a reality show, and then they move on to the next thing. So if Iran is to liberalize, I'm not sure this was the way to go. I could be wrong about this. Maybe this works out in the end, and that the military damage, especially to the proxies and the revealing of the weakness, authoritarian regimes do crack down and get paranoid, but they're also at their most vulnerable when they've been revealed to be weak, which is what I think has happened here. And let's face it, since October 7th, there's a line of action that really suggests the Iranian regime has just kind of put itself in this situation over and over again. But let's never underestimate the temptation of, if not a North Korea, Iran's too big and too educated to do a North Korea kind of crackdown. But when people went into the streets against Putin years ago, Putin bet on repression and fear, and it paid off. He won. And he's going to be there until the day he dies. So.
And by the way, Tom, I agree with that in a sense that that is happening in Iran as we speak. Okay, in the earlier years after the revolution, the crackdown of the regime was extremely brutal. And again, people are fearing that would be the case right now, and we are seeing evidence of that. And the last thing I would say to that point is that every single time that talks of diplomacy and engagement with again quote unquote moderate reformist forces within the Iranian government failed, it was only the most radical forces and factions of the IRGC that were emboldened. We also have to remember that the Islamic regime of Iran is extremely divided and fractured from within. And so whatever comes out of this regime doesn't come from one faction, but whoever holds most power at that moment.
Tom, I just want to come back to that idea you raised earlier that the Trump administration might perceive this, as you put it, as a one and done situation. And I guess that's not necessarily anything new. There's been this sort of narrative of hubris for the last few decades, this idea that air power alone, clean, quick, almost risk-free, can deliver the preferred outcomes. And I'm not sure it's happened a single time yet. Is he really going to be able to walk away from it, though, if he does just lose interest? To paraphrase somebody else talking about something else, just because America's not interested in the Middle East doesn't mean the Middle East isn't interested in America. Well,
there's two problems. One is that, yes, Americans do have a remarkable faith in the air power. There's probably the only one thing you could really point to is maybe Kosovo and the eventual fall of Milosevic, which was primarily done through air power. Mm-hmm. But that's a long time ago. I don't think that's the Trump administration's problem, in the sense that they are overly reliant on air power or thinking this through. I think you have to bring in American domestic politics here. Trump is always about winning the news cycle. He thought that doing this would be great press. He would get great images out of it. He would win the news cycle. He would puts out all these loopy posts on Truth Social about unconditional surrender, and as Pete Hegseth is talking about the most complicated military plan in history. And none of it's taking. I mean, it's the majority of Americans were against doing this, as it turns out. And his own base hates this stuff. So he can't go back. It's already been a difficult thing for him to try to, I mean, you've seen the vice president trying to jam this, square peg into a round hole of Trump's earlier promises. So it's not like Trump saying, air power, I have this strategic goal in Iran and air power was the preferred tool. And now it's not where he doesn't think that way. He's like, look, I thought I was going to get good press out of this. I didn't. It's time to move on to something else. I don't want to have to do this again because then I look weak and I look incompetent. I mean, they're boxing themselves in. You can't go on TV every day and say totally successful, obliterated, decimated, and then say, but now we have to go do it again. And so I just don't think we're trying to impose. This always happens with Trump, where rational people try to impose some sense of order on Trump's thinking, when Trump is in fact more like he's a goldfish. I mean, he just darts from thing to thing with, no memory of the past and no expectation of the future, and just tries to kind of win the moment that he's in. And this moment, he's just trying to win. Right now, what you see in Washington is he's trying to win the news cycle around this one strike. He's not really sitting around thinking, have I done something good for humanity? Have I helped Iran? Have I, curtailed a nuclear program? He's just thinking, am I winning or losing? And right now he's losing. And I don't think he's going to want to go back and have to do this again, especially because the people that he counts on the most have already started turning against him on this issue. He promised them no more involvement in the Middle East. And now he's sending bombers into a country of 92 million people in the Middle East. And I don't think especially because this didn't work out very well for him, I don't think he wants to do it again.
Tara, just a closing thought, and we're going to try and grasp for some optimism here. Is it vaguely possible that the Iranians right now, weakened and diminished and faintly embarrassed as they are, might look at Trump and Netanyahu and decide that Trump is at least, if not the good cop, then the less bad cop, and try to reach some sort of accommodation with the United States? If it's not necessarily possible in the immediate future that Iran turns into a flourishing liberal democracy, is it at least possible they might drop the death to America stuff?
I really want to end on a hopeful note, but even so, it doesn't matter what the Iranian regime does externally with relations to Israel and the United States. What's at stake is the lives of 90 million Iranian people who might very well end up living under repression. Sure, the rhetorics of death to Israel and death to America have long existed. I mean, I remember going to school in Iran and we were supposed to chant these chants, and I never did. But the reality is, despite the regime's relationship with the United States, which would only be there for its own longevity, you're talking about 90 million who will continue to be repressed unless the regime changes its behavior domestically, and unless the world, once and for all, hears the grievances of the Iranian people, who have so much to contribute, not just to their own country, but regionally. And to Tom's point about President Trump's destructive behavior, this is to the cost, at the end of the day, is the lives of Iranian people as well as Israelis and others in that region. And the last thought I would like to leave you with is that the Iranian people are some of the most pro-America people in that entire region. And it is worth tapping into that civil society, whether that's by way of engaging with the regime in its current form or differently. But the biggest asset there for the United States and that entire region are the people of Iran.
Tara Kangarlou, author of The Heartbeat of Iran, and Tom Nichols, staff writer at The Atlantic. Thanks both for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.